A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
Birthdays are supposed to be joyful celebrations, but as I turn 28 today, the only thing I feel is a gnawing sense of finality. I'm sitting here in my dimly lit apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes and the sparse whispers of my own doubts echoing off the walls, a sinister symphony that harmonizes with the rain tapping softly against the window panes. My social media feeds are flooded with happy birthday messages from friends and family, their words empty echoes that resonate hollow in the chambers of my mind. They don't know what I know, none of them do. I guess that's why I'm writing this now, a confession of sorts to whomever might stumble upon it after tomorrow. Maybe my story will serve as a warning or, perhaps, a shred of proof that some of the terrors that swim just beneath the surface of our everyday life are all too real. It was 6 months ago when things began to unravel. I got an email from a sender I didn't recognize, a simple subject line reading your future. Thinking it was spam, I almost deleted it, but an inexplicable compulsion made me open it. The email contained a single sentence: "In 6 months, on your 28th birthday, the world will reset, and only you will remember." I laughed it off at first, a joke surely, probably some sort of marketing stunt. But something in the pit of my stomach churned uneasily as if warning me subconsciously. As days turned into weeks, a series of inexplicable occurrences began to haunt my life. It started with the little things: keys disappearing, lights flickering, shadows moving just out of the corner of my eye. I quit drinking caffeine and tried to shake off the paranoia, attributing it to lack of sleep and stress from work. But then the dreams started. Every night, I found myself in a vast, empty world, eerily silent except for a low hum emanating from nowhere. I was always alone, surrounded by a dense fog that played tricks on my mind, teasing glimpses of figures that vanished whenever I tried to focus. Upon waking, the details would slip away, leaving only an unsettling residue of fear. Around month 3, reality itself began to fray. Time seemed to distort, minutes stretched into hours, or sometimes fell away like dead leaves from a tree. People I knew appeared slightly different, a mole that wasn't there before, an unfamiliar expression in their eyes. I even caught glimpses of strangers on the street whispering my name. Convinced I was losing my mind, I sought help from a therapist who prescribed medication that did nothing to dull the surreal dissonance of my existence. Desperation drove me back to the email. I spent nights researching, looking for clues, patterns, anything that made sense of this looming deadline. I found forums, corners of the internet filled with people like me, receiving cryptic messages, sharing a vision of an impending reset. Most posts were filled with hysteria, but some claimed they could stop it, talking of rituals or extreme acts of sacrifice. Their ambiguity and lack of coherence left me skeptical, but the sense of camaraderie was a lifeline. 5 more months passed in a haze, reality tying knots around my brain. I retreated from friends and family, their faces now unfamiliar masks I couldn't trust. My nights were spent poring through conspiracy theories, ancient texts, and urban legends, desperately seeking an answer or way out. It's now the eve of my birthday, and I'm no closer to understanding what's happening or what's about to unfold. There's just one thing I cling to, a recurring fragment from my dreams, a voice that finally broke through the hum, a child's voice. It said, "Open your eyes," just before everything went dark. I woke this morning resolute, the clarity paradoxically arising from a decision to embrace the inevitable. I'm prepared to end it tomorrow, before it can end me, but there's a part of me whispering that perhaps this darkness isn't something to fear. The strange serenity I find myself in tells me that maybe, just maybe, the reset isn't a cataclysmic end but rather a chance for rebirth, a cleansing of the chaos plaguing my reality. And yet, as I pen this last rambling confession, doubt seeps back in, mingling with the rainfall outside, whispering, "Save yourself." Tomorrow I will walk to the edge of reason, clutching the ties to my intangible whispers. If this is my end, reader, remember my story not as a descent into madness but as a testimony to the terror lurking beneath our fabricated normalcy. If you wake tomorrow remembering something you cannot place, a face, a world, a life, perhaps you've survived another reset. And perhaps, so have I. You know, it was the kind of night you don't even think much about it all until later on, the evening when your casual remark spirals into something much bigger and more sinister than you could have ever predicted. My boyfriend, Tom, had this tradition of making tacos every Tuesday, something he picked up from his late grandmother, so these weekly tacos had a significance beyond the standard Tex-Mex fare. So suffice it to say, when I offhandedly mentioned that the tacos tasted a bit off, I didn't anticipate the cascading series of events it would set into motion. It happened over dinner, The sort of typically mundane one where we'd chat about work and our future plans in the soft glow of candlelight. After a few bites, I noticed the meat tasted slightly different, a subtle tang that felt misplaced among the usual flavors. Tom watched me expectantly, waiting for my reaction as usual. I hesitated but told myself honesty was the best policy, so I blurted out, "I'm not sure what's different, baby, but these aren't quite up to the usual standard." His slight nod seemed accepting, the way he always took feedback with a calm demeanor. But something flickered in his eyes that night, an uneasy shift that I chose to ignore. The first indication that something was amiss came later that night as I was brushing my teeth. Behind me in the mirror, I caught sight of Tom just standing in the hallway, unmoving, his eyes fixed on me with an almost unnerving intensity. "Is everything all right?" I asked, mouth half full of foamy toothpaste. He didn't answer immediately, just continued to watch me with that odd expression before slipping back into the shadows without a word. I should have been more concerned, but there was a rational part of my brain that quickly dismissed it as one of those late-night zombie states we all wander into from time to time. The next morning, however, I found the kitchen in an unexpected state of disarray, the counters cluttered with various ingredients, half-used spices, and a sticky residue coating every surface. At first, I thought maybe Tom had needed to recreate the tacos to perfect them. He was a bit of a culinary perfectionist that way, but when I saw him later, he acted as if nothing was out of the ordinary, chatting away about his day while completely sidestepping any mention of the previous night's culinary debacle or the early morning mess. As the week dragged on, Tom's behavior grew more peculiar with each passing day. He'd become painstaking in his kitchen activities, spending hours behind closed doors, where I could hear the rhythmic chopping of knives and the sizzling of pans interspersed with whirring blenders. Sometimes I'd step into the kitchen only to be gently, but firmly, ushered away, Tom insisting he wanted to surprise me with his latest creations. But every meal that followed was exactly the same: tacos, tacos, and more tacos, each plate more elaborate and garnished than the last, yet there was always an undercurrent of that strange, unidentified flavor that seemed to grow more pronounced after each iteration. I should have felt spoiled by the attention, but his fixation was beginning to unsettle me. When I returned home one particularly dreary Thursday evening, I noticed Tom had disappeared somewhere. His car was absent from the driveway. It was unlike him to leave without a word, so I began to search the house. Eventually, I ventured into the basement, a place I usually avoided due to its labyrinthine clutter of stored memories and unfinished projects. The air was cooler there, tinged with that distinct earthy smell of old wood and forgotten things. As I navigated through boxes and miscellaneous objects, I stumbled upon a disturbing scene: a small makeshift kitchen setup, a fold-up table cluttered with various herbs unfamiliar to me, some with colors so deep and strange they almost looked extraterrestrial. What truly caught my attention, though, were the notebooks, pages upon pages of notes scribbled in Tom's hasty scrawl, detailing each meal he'd made and various experiments in search of the perfect recipe. But much of the text was incoherent, filled with symbols and a language I couldn't understand, peppered with drawings that looked like twisted, nightmarish versions of kitchenware. In hindsight, I should have backed out right there and then, but curiosity mixed with an unsettling dread propelled me further into investigating. That night, as Tom slept beside me, seemingly blissfully unaware, I couldn't shake the visceral feeling of unease that clung to me like a heavy fog. My dreams were harrowing and filled with images of those twisted drawings come to life, creatures constructed out of utensils and flesh, writhing and advancing towards me in a distorted rhythm that followed the beating of my own heart. When I woke, drenched in a cold sweat, I found Tom absent once more, the space beside me still warm, indicating he'd only recently risen. It became clear I needed answers. Every instinct screamed that something was deeply wrong with this once charming, taciturn man I thought I knew. Delving into his personal belongings was not my proudest moment, but I needed to understand. Hidden at the back of his wardrobe, beneath piles of clothes he rarely wore, I found the final document, an old, leather-bound journal that looked much older than anything Tom should possess. The journal belonged not to Tom, but to his grandmother, the one whose legacy inspired Taco Tuesdays in the first place. Her handwriting was a careful, sloping script that spoke of her love for her culinary crafts, until it twisted into an obsession eerily similar to Tom's escalating mania. There were references to places and people unknown to normal society, whispers of an ancient recipe once passed from chef to chef, all of whom ended up succumbing to its strange allure. There was a darkness attached to this heritage of culinary perfection, something that demanded more than just skill but an unnatural, sacrificial devotion. It dawned on me with horror that ever since my small critique, Tom had been pulled into the same spiraling madness that had claimed his grandmother. They were all searching for that elusive taste, a taste of something forbidden and inescapable. I was caught in a paralyzing maze of decisions when I heard the door click open and shut, Tom's shadow lengthening along our hallway walls as he returned. I knew I couldn't confront him, not when he was embroiled in something none of us fully understood. So feigning ignorance, I placed the journal back where I'd found it, and over the next few days, quietly made my preparations to leave. It wasn't easy, the love I'd felt was genuine, but everything about our life now felt tainted by his pursuit of perfection, a phantom that lurked just beyond the borders of reason and logic. The day I finally walked out, I left a note behind, urging him in the only words I could think of to find his way back, away from the all-consuming hunger for something impossible and inherently destructive. That was weeks ago, and now I sit here writing this with mixed feelings of relief and sadness. Occasionally, I hear about Tom, snippets passed along by mutual friends who drop hints about his successes or resurgence with culinary fame. But I suspect underneath it all, the tacos he makes now brim with that same darkness, a personal concoction only he truly savors. Looking back, I often wonder if my honest critique had ignited what his grandmother's legacy started, or if, in truth, something far older and insidious had always resided in him, merely waiting for the chance to emerge. I've been worried sick ever since my wife, Emily, left to check out a new listing for the real estate agency she works with. When she hurried out the door that morning, I could sense her excitement. It was a historic, isolated mansion that had just come on the market, the kind of place with grand staircases and rumors of secret passageways. It was her dream gig, but something gnawed at me as she waved goodbye. That gnaw turned into dread when I didn't hear from her by evening. Calls went straight to voicemail, and texts remained unread. By the time the sunset turned into an eerie glow over the landscape, I knew I had to go check on her. Grabbing my keys, I headed out, trying to convince myself that she'd just lost track of time in the labyrinthine corridors of an old house. The drive felt interminable, the lonelier roads lined with dense trees closing in like claustrophobic walls. When I finally arrived, the bone-chilling wind and sound of the wrought iron gates creaking open set my heart thrumming in my chest. There it stood, an imposing structure looming out of the darkness, almost daring me to enter. The windows appeared like soulless eyes, staring down at me as if they knew something I didn't. A shiver coursed through me, it felt like the atmosphere itself was warning me to stay away. Inside, the air was cold and stale, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. I called out her name, my voice echoing against the high ceilings. No answer. I found her car in the driveway, yet everything inside the mansion was dark, silent. Floors creaked beneath my weight with each hesitant step, and with the fading daylight seeping through the window, I could barely make out the dusty furniture draped in sheets. Remnants of a life once vibrant and now forgotten. I checked my phone again, just in case, hoping for a signal that refused to cooperate. My heart pounded louder than my footsteps as I moved deeper into the house, calling her name again, the syllables swallowed by the shadowy walls. My imagination started playing tricks, shadows moving just beyond my vision, a distant murmur almost like whispers taunting me from behind shut doors. 10 minutes felt like hours as I explored room after room, each more unnerving than the last. And then, turning a corner, I stumbled into what seemed to be an ornate study, a fireplace looming and cold. There, on the dusty floor, lay her phone, screen cracked. The sight wrenched my gut, panic rising with each breath. Had she been in danger? As I pocketed the phone, I heard a noise. A muffled sob? I froze, listening, straining to determine its source. It led me to a narrow, almost hidden door, tucked behind a large bookshelf. Pushing it open, I found a small spiral staircase, descending into the earth like a helix into the abyss. Trembling, I descended, the air growing colder with each step. The sobbing grew louder, echoing up the spiral like a harrowing lament. At the base, there was a darkened room, damp and smelling of mildew. And there she was, Emily, hunched and shaking, her ankle caught in a rusted trap's iron teeth. Relief flooded through me, followed by horror at her condition. Quickly, I rushed to her side, tears in both our eyes as I comforted her and unlatched the old trap. Her whispered words were frenetic and jumbled, a tale of ghostly encounters, shadow figures that emerged from the walls as if the house itself were alive, rejecting her presence. She described how doors had closed on their own, and voices had coaxed her into this bitter undercroft where the trap had ensnared her in her panic. With her arm around my shoulder, we hurried up the stairs. Every sound in that house felt magnified, each creak a threat, each gust of wind a disembodied warning. Once outside, we dared not look back, the gravel crunching beneath our desperate footsteps as we returned to the car. Safe within the confines of the driver's seat, it dawned on me how close we had come to being consumed by whatever ancient menace lay coiled within those walls. Emily, still shivering, rested her head against the window, whispering she'd never set foot in an old house again. We've tried to forget about that day, but every so often, something reminds us, a chill when the wind blows just right, or the way shadows sometimes bend in a hallway, and we remember the house that didn't want us to leave. We never did find out who set the trap or if the ghosts were real, but it's enough to know that some places hold secrets better left unexplored. Growing up, my childhood was punctuated by a peculiar kind of silence, one shadowed by the unspoken, secreted away into the dust-laden corners of my old Victorian family home. My parents were the kind who adhered to peculiar traditions and enigmatic rules, the strictest of which was, never explore the attic, and certainly never speak of what's inside. As a child, my curiosity was a feral beast, caged only by the loving yet stern assurances of my parents that there was nothing but old furniture and cobwebs, the living quarters for spiders and forgotten things. For the longest time, I abided by this rule. The keys to the attic remained hung on a silver chain worn perpetually around my father's neck, jangling with every step he took as if serving a constant reminder of the forbidden. Yet, the mysteries of childhood are rarely laid to rest with simple assurances, and there were nights when strange noises would filter down through the plaster, elusive whispers and delicate thuds that seemed too deliberate to be merely the house settling. I'd mention them casually during dinner, always receiving a dismissive chuckle from my parents, who would exchange knowing glances, their eyes clouding just for a fraction of a second, a fleeting moment of something I couldn't decipher then. As I grew older, the happenings took on a new form, less like curious noises and more like soft footsteps above my ceiling, sometimes growing frantic as if dozens of feet joined in an echoing dance. The nights when I was alone were the worst, each creak feeling like a herald of some unseen presence. Despite the mounting dread, my parents' rule held an ironclad grip on my tongue and my actions, for they were good people, kind and thoughtful in every way that counted, except this one, perplexing exception. It was only when I turned 17 that my life, and the secrets of my attic, unfolded in a way that shook the very core of my understanding of family. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me with the kind of nervous anticipation that comes only from the promise of solitary freedom in a house so full of mysteries. As the clouds rolled in and the evening grew into night, I finally gathered the courage, perhaps triggered by the desperate resound of the most violent footsteps yet, that seemed to shake the very walls. The keys had been left on the dining table, their steel glinting under the overhead light like a siren's call. With trembling hands, I took them, each step up the narrow staircase a test of my resolve. The door was heavy as if weighted down by more than just old memories, and its hinges protested when I forced it open. The space within was larger than I had imagined, a cavernous maw leaking the scent of dust and age, but it was the cool breeze brushing across my skin that unsettled me the most. There, amid the disorderly remnants of another century, stood three figures, pale and gaunt with eyes that mirrored mine, a sinister kinship that struck me immediately. They beckoned me with desperate eyes, their voices a tangled whisper that spoke directly to the marrow of my soul, claiming kinship yet unknown to me. "We're your brothers," one said, regret woven deeply into every syllable. And as the truth unfurled, my mind reeled with the implications. Hidden away by necessity or fear, my parents had kept these siblings concealed, tethered to the anonymity of the attic's shadows due to reasons yet unclear. Their story was a puzzle, fragmented but given color by their insistent claims of love and neglect, kindness and betrayal, a picture painted with the brushstrokes of secret lives. I wanted to embrace them, these spectral parts of my own history, but a chilling realization clawed at my subconscious: if they were secreted away, what did my parents fear? My thoughts tangled and danced with their whispers as they recounted tales of attempts to leave, of unseen threats and grim familial duties, their pleas bleeding into my consciousness like ink in water. The attic's presence was alive around us, pressing in with memories and the weight of secrets too monstrous to comprehend. The deeper they drew me into their reality, the more the boundaries blurred between safety and suffocation, family and foe, echoes of promises and betrayals etched into the very bones of the house. And then, as if triggered by my revelation, the house emitted a deep groan, the sudden fury of a life reaching its cataclysm. I was thrust back through the doorway in a panicked whirlwind, my fingers losing the grip on truths I'd only just begun to uncover. By some misfortunate mercy, the door slammed shut with a finality that resonated in my bones, trapping the reality of my secret siblings back in the sepulchral confines of the attic's embrace. The key fell from my grasp, bouncing once before resting in silence, a sentinel in its inaction. The truth of my family lay barred behind a door now stronger than iron, my voice, my resolve sealed in the prison of my heart by the unwavering declarations of love from parents who understood more than they'd ever let slip, their choice is a contradiction of protection and punishment. From that night on, my home became simply a house, a structure of conflicted histories and hidden truths. My once secure world inverted, leaving me to navigate a minefield of secrets I was never meant to discover. My parents, when questioned, offered only quiet tears and trembling apologies, gestures weighted with more emotion than silence should hold. Our family dinners grew quieter, the clinking of silverware muted percussion against the ghosts we all knew lingered just beyond the ceiling. Each day, the attic loomed larger in its power, a towering testament to the fragility of truth. My secret siblings remained a whisper in the recesses of my mind, their existence a haunting cadence, a promise unfulfilled. And though my tongue remained bound by the unspeakable pact of our family's history, I carried their stories, their faces, indistinguishable from mine, locked away behind eyes that once looked at the world with innocence but now see it as it truly is, a tapestry woven with secrets, far too dire to be unraveled. I never imagined my life spiraling into the chaos that I'm now drowning in, but here I am, writing this confession more as a farewell than a plea for help. My name is Jacob, a name I hope hasn't made it into too many police reports yet, but one that's undoubtedly known by a few shadowy figures in the dim back rooms of New York's underbelly. It all started innocently enough, a night of poker with friends on the Lower East Side, the gritty yet vibrant neighborhood that's home to more stories than anyone could recount in a lifetime. That night, I sat across from faces that didn't seem all that menacing at first, men in suits who generously bought rounds for the house, laughed too loud, and were either too interested in their cards or not at all, the kind of nonchalance that should have sent warning bells ringing in my inexperienced head. But the whirlwind of high-stakes betting was intoxicating, and I was too amazed by my own beginner's luck to notice the spiderweb I was spinning for myself. By the end of the night, I was up 20 grand, the smile plastered on my face as fake as the Rolex I wore. Sven, the lead guy, slicked back hair and eyes like a pit of snakes, clapped me on the back a little too hard, congratulating me with a grin that didn't reach the chill in his eyes. It wasn't long before a once-a-month poker game became a weekly ritual, promoted by Sven, who was always a little too generous with credit lines. I thought I was making friends, but I was sinking into the marsh without realizing it. The stakes got higher, the risks bigger, and before long, I owed more than I could imagine repaying. Sven's men, Marco and Luis, weren't exactly forthcoming about interest rates either. By the time I realized how deep I was in, the $20,000 I once won was dwarfed by a debt that seemed impossible to repay. That's when reality started taking a jagged edge, and I wished I could reset my life like one of those pinball machines when a ball gets stuck, except, here, I was the one who was stuck, and the machine was tilted out of my control. Every day after, Sven would remind me with a cheerful menace in his voice about the exposure I was under. Fail to pay, and I wouldn't just be cut off from the game, I'd be cut off permanently from daylight. I tried scraping money together, ignored the simmering panic in my gut that threatened to swallow me whole. But Sven wasn't fond of excuses. He had a reputation to maintain, after all, and he was very keen on reminding me that refusing to pay a business partner would skyrocket his costs, a downfall he wouldn't experience alone. A few persuasive visits later, my fingers taped up and nose bloodied, I knew they weren't just idle threats. Desperation does funny things to a man. It becomes a constant, almost physical companion. I took a second job bartending at a club that didn't ask questions, working myself to exhaustion trying to accumulate enough for a down payment at least. But saving was like trying to catch the tide with a colander, the urgency of Sven's ticking clock always one tick too fast. I considered running, changing my name, and heading to some nameless town in the Midwest. But I had no illusions. If they could find a man halfway across the globe, the prairies wouldn't hide me for long. One chilly evening, walking home under the fluorescent glow of street lamps, reality crashed in another layer deeper. A shadow detached itself from the corner, approaching with the kind of casual intent that screamed danger. Gabe. He was their enforcer, muscles on top of muscles, hands that could crush stones, and an uncanny ability to appear from nowhere. He didn't say much, just handed me a letter, Sven's seal imprinted ominously, and vanished back into the darkness from whence he came. My hands shook as I opened it, and the black ink might as well have been my own blood. 1 week left or the consequences would be more definitive, the letter said in that perfunctory tone that promised nothing good. With 97 hours and a ticking bomb hanging over my head, I did the unthinkable, I called the cops. Not looking for protection, I wasn't that naive, I knew better than to assume the cops could or would protect me from people like Sven. Instead, I thought maybe a sting or getting them involved would make Sven back off. But the officer who took my call seemed more interested in hints of collusion between me and the mafia than helping me. After a few probing questions, I realized I'd only dug myself deeper, painting a target not just on my back, but on my very life essence. The silence that followed the conversation was deafening, the realization that in trying to help myself, I'd only signed my fate's death warrant struck hard. I was out of time, out of options, yet in that darkest moment, clarity settled in. I had less than 4 days to engineer one last-ditch effort to escape. I started going through my contacts, unearthing fleeting acquaintances whose morality was as questionable as their sobriety. It was a gamble, but my whole life had become a pile of bets on bad horses. I reached out to Troy, a hacker I met once through mutual friends, one of those whose voice you hear but never really see. I promised him a hefty reward if he could ghost my identity, leave enough digital breadcrumbs to distract Sven and his cronies, and give me a day's head start, money I still didn't have but hoped to scrounge. Troy, intrigued by the chaos and perhaps sympathy wrapped in curiosity at my predicament, agreed. Miraculously, with Troy's digital wizardry, I managed to slip under their radar, at least temporarily. I liquidated what few assets I had, emptied my accounts into untraceable transactions, and slipped away in the dead of night, my heart pounding in rhythm to the city's cacophonous pulse. I left behind the person I was, Jacob, the fool, and embraced the hollow uncertainty of being no one. I stayed in the shadows, moving between cities, hostels, and the occasional sympathetic stranger or another like me, fugitives of our own making. I knew it couldn't last forever, that lurking just beyond the next dawn might be Gabe or one of Sven's men, the end of this game that had already gone on far too long. And as I write this, tucked away in another nameless room far from the bustling heart of the city that swallowed me whole, I realize I am the ghost of my own story, without conclusion, just an eternal echo lost in the corridors of time. Maybe, just maybe, the writing of this tale will free me, or damn me further, only time will tell. When I was 7, my older sister, Elara, showed me the first of many dark and inexplicable cruelties she would inflict upon me. It was a sweltering summer afternoon when she beckoned me into the cramped, dusty attic, her voice a sweet melody concealing venom. The moment I crossed the threshold, she shut the creaky wooden door behind us, plunging the room into an eerie dimness save for a narrow shaft of light piercing through a tiny window. Her smile was something I'd grown wary of, too wide, too bright, as if her joy fed on my discomfort. In her hand, unusually pale in the subdued light, she held a small, mushy bird, its lifeless body dangling limply. "Look what I've found," she cooed, her fingers flexing around its small frame, and I realized with a shiver that she intended me to feel its brittleness, its stillness. That was the genesis of my secret. Over the years, she became a droid at tormenting me with twisted games and errands, whispering threats I didn't fully comprehend but feared deeply enough to obey. At school, to everyone else, she was the accomplished elder sibling, the epitome of academic brilliance and extracurricular allure. At home, she was a ghost haunting my aspirations for normalcy, a predator stalking the shadows of my childhood. When I approached our parents, their belief in Elara's saintly disposition eclipsed my plea. The sharp rebuke in their eyes sent me spiraling into silence, reaffirming my position as a fluctuating variable in Elara's sadistic calculus. As the years blurred, routine encounters at home, innocuous to the unseeing, transformed into strategic ambushes, meticulously orchestrated scenarios intended to belittle, erode, seize power over me. Tripping me discreetly when relatives were over, sowing doubt in teachers' minds with those meticulous tales spun with calculated precision, each act was a ritual dissection of my spirit. Her psychological shackles tightened when she subtly started manipulating my friendships, sowing discord with an artfulness that bewildered and bruised my sense of belonging. Yet, recounting these tales, I remind myself that it was the dinner party 5 years ago, a famous crux point, that undid me. Elara, now thriving in her respectability, had gathered the family, her friends, colleagues, peacocking before them while I merely hovered by the fringes, a peripheral shadow in her well-lit world. That night, within the falsely jovial confines of our dining room, something snapped. I don't quite recall what prompted the exchange, perhaps it was the wine, or the sheer weight of her blithe omnipresence that had me confronting her. Words tumbled out, a torrent of repressed confessions, her malice, her despotism, my silent suffering, all threadbare and exposed. The room shifted uneasily, and in that spotlight, Elara's charm faltered for just a fraction of a heartbeat, a flicker of the truth. I had expected vindication, a collective understanding, yet was met with the cold eye glare of collective disbelief and suspicion. Elara, ever the master of manipulation, rode the storm with tears, ingeniously turning the tables, fashioning my breakdown as an unfortunate, unprovoked outburst. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, a melodrama of concern, with tender reassurances muting any residual doubts among our guests. For every scream for help paralyzed behind my lips, Elara had a ready, meticulously curated counter-narrative. The psychology of her tactics lay in their cunning simplicity, like a stealthy poison administered drop by drop, killing not the body but the spirit. Retreating into the folds of apology, feigned smiles stitched up my lips, grim acceptance blanketed my logic. Alone with my thoughts once more, my reality twisted inward, curled around my heart, a silent resentment I dare not nourish lest I implode. Yet tonight, a decade past that pivotal night, the shadows she's laying are no longer my shackles but my stepping stones. It started with a simple journal. Idle scrawling thoughts expanded into conversations with those tethered to their own tales of malice and oddity. Strangers became allies, my whispered truths echoed in other unheard voices across boards, stories like pebbles cascading into the vast ocean of shared understanding. The irony hasn't escaped me, perhaps Elara's inadvertently given me clarity, gifting me insight into the minds of those who bask in darkness. The shadow of her legacy remains, echoing in the spaces between memory and reality as I pen these words. Not for justice or vengeance, these are aspirations for the unwounded, but for delineation, for acceptance of the void she created. So, when you ask why my sister abused me, the only solace I find nestles in the ambiguity of human capacity, beyond comprehension, beyond justification, an enigma I've learned to unravel, paradoxically, while bound tightly within its snares. My husband and I have been married for 7 years, and in that time, I've learned that there are some battles you pick and some that are best left untouched. For a while, I thought our life was simple. We had 2 kids, Emma and Jake, and a house in the suburbs with a garden that desperately needed weeding. My husband, Mark, was never the 9-to-5 type. He worked odd jobs, always with a new hobby he swore would be our gold mine. I didn't mind at first. It gave him something to do while being home with the kids. That was until I noticed the changes. It started subtly, Emma crying over things that seemed ridiculous, Jake needing more reassurance than a kid his age should require. I chalked it up to phases, growing pains. But then there was the night Emma came to me, her little hands trembling, and said, "Mom, why does Dad make us play the game?" That word, the game, sent an odd chill through me. What was she talking about? Inquisitively, I approached Mark and asked about the game. He brushed it off with a laugh and a pat on the head for her, but there was something hollow in his eyes. The next few days, I started observing more closely. Mark would take them into the basement, and I would hear odd sounds, muffled voices, and sometimes a strange rhythmic chanting. Curiosity morphed into fear when Jake came to me, black circles under his eyes begging me to stop Dad from playing. My heart broke, and pieces of it pierced my soul. I knew I had to intervene. I called my sister and a few friends, explaining the little I understood. They arrived one afternoon seated around our dining table, whispering concerns while Mark was busy playing with the kids. As they entered the house, there was a noticeable chill, as if inviting something malevolent. Their skepticism bloomed into disbelief as Emma and Jake descended the stairs, tears streaming silently down their cheeks. Voices raised, we demanded answers from Mark, who stood strangely calm amidst our chaos. He said, "It's not what you think, the game is for their benefit, for all of us. Soon you'll understand." I begged him to stop, to change whatever practice he was imparting. He smirked knowingly, claiming he'd been taught by generations before him, and turning back was neither wise nor possible. Desperation clawed at me. My friends and family left, urging me to go to the authorities, but what was I to say? My husband plays games with our children in the basement, and it terrifies me? Watching them leaving, reality coiled tighter around me. I decided to find out for myself what this game was. The basement door loomed like an entrance to some unfathomable pit. That night, after Mark fell asleep, I stole away with only my courage as a companion. The basement was dark, save for a flickering bulb that added an eerie glow to the room. There was a circle drawn on the floor, surrounded by symbols I couldn't comprehend, and an innocuous deck of cards placed in the center. Something primal urged me to retreat. But I ignored it, stepping closer. As I examined the cards, a sudden gust of wind, impossible for an enclosed space, nearly extinguished the light, giving rise to shadows that danced eerily on the walls. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure, tall yet indistinct, observing silently. It was then that I realized this was no game. Hatred interwoven with malevolence burgeoned from its presence, fueling a conviction that whatever Mark had begun wouldn't stop until it was done. The next day, Mark acted as though nothing was amiss. I brought up the basement and the cards as casually as I could, mentioning the intervention and how worried everyone was. His demeanor shifted, anger infused his calm exterior, eyes flashing with an emotion too alien to name. "You can't understand," was all he whispered before turning away. That night, as the children slept better under the glow of nightlights and dream catchers, I sat guard, mind racing. How could I keep them safe? What would lull this sinister presence back into dormancy? Days turned to weeks, our living room littered with abandonment as friends withdrew, unable to comprehend the darkness we lived in. I pored over dusty books of folklore and esoteric practices, hoping for a gleam of understanding. The game, it seemed, was a rite, a merging of the old and the new, a summoning thought extinct. Determined, I concocted a plan. When Mark took them downstairs, I'd intervene, severing the connection he had with the spirit. It was a full moon when my resolve solidified. The air was thick, pressed against silence stretched too long. Distracting Mark with the promise of a new card game I had found, his eyes glowed with interest, a chill creeping into his expression. Enthralled, he agreed to only my presence. In the basement, as I marveled at my own bravery, my hands cold against the deck, I called forth the courage that shadow dared to sap away. The ritual began, and each flip resonated a resonance deeper than sound, almost a pulse. Just as shadows crested towards something darker, the door swung open. Emma and Jake stood at the precipice, hands clasped, spirits aligned. Not by sheer force but by love and innocence did the shadow recoil. Their belief that darkness could be vanquished wove a tapestry of luminescence, ignorable to all but the most ingrained malevolence. Mark stared, then slumped, whatever tether he harbored snapped clean. In time, the echoes of the game faded, and healing cloaked our memories. Mark, once consumed, emerged gentle, reshaped by unexplained grace and perhaps an understanding shared beyond. We moved away, the garden once again requiring weeding, whispers of laughter replacing unsaid regrets. Whatever lived with us, it taught an indelible lesson: while shadows may loom, love rekindles light through even the deepest abyss. The shadows in my family grow long and twisted as I recall the last time I defied them, choosing solitude over so-called familial unity, flaking on what they called a family vacation that ended up being a descent into something I can barely comprehend. It started when my parents, with their forced smiles and travel brochures spread across the kitchen table, announced a getaway to some remote cabin deep in the woods. Their enthusiasm was palpable, but so was the underlying urgency I couldn't place, as if this vacation was less about relaxation and more about ritual. I had my plans, work deadlines piling up, and frankly, the idea of a cabin retreat without cell service seemed more isolating than de-stressing. You don't say no to my family, not unless you want to deal with the cold disdain of being that child who ruined things. My older sister, Mara, immediately jumped on board, her eyes glinting with excitement that felt more feigned than genuine. I held my ground, stating firmly that I wouldn't go. "Am I the asshole for wanting to stay home?" I asked, hoping for some show of support, but instead received the usual side eyes and muttered agreements that family is everything. Surprisingly, the trip went on without any further protest from them, and as they packed up the old SUV, an eerie silence fell over the house that seemed to echo with an absence rather than tranquility. For the first time, I was alone in the family home, basking in what I thought would be a peaceful reprieve. However, the quiet soon became oppressive, a buzz in the back of my mind that kept reminding me of countless unsaid things. On the third night of their absence, my phone buzzed repeatedly, texts from Mara. Her messages were garbled, almost as if they'd struggled through layers of static, but the fragments I managed to piece together painted a chilling atmosphere. "Something is wrong here, not what it, Mom and Dad, strange rituals." The words dissolved into incoherence. Chilled by the cold grip of unease, I tried calling but the calls always failed. No service, no connection, just a mocking beeping. I took to social media, seeking normalcy, or perhaps distraction, but instead, I found something far more unsettling. Posts from friends, acknowledging my family's trip, asking why there was something off about the pictures Mara posted. I hadn't accounted for social media. She had uploaded photos that at first glance seemed typical: trees, a lake, our parents, but a closer inspection clutched my heart with an icy hand. The eyes of my parents seemed vacant, the smiles stretched too thin, twisted at odd angles like they were forced wide open, and there was something else in the background of those serene forest images, dark figures, obscured by trees, yet undeniably omnipresent. Heart hammering in my chest, I messaged my friend Alex, someone grounded enough not to dismiss my growing panic. He agreed to drive to the cabin, located about 5 hours outside the city, the longest, most tension-riddled drive of my life. Upon arriving, an oppressive stillness hung over the surroundings, blending perfectly with the approaching dusk. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, and I found my family's SUV parked but oddly crooked, keys still in the ignition. Every instinct screamed, urging me to turn back, but Mara's incomplete messages were a beacon pulling me forward. The cabin door swung open with an eerie creak that shattered the silence like glass. Inside, it appeared abandoned in haste, bags haphazardly thrown, a chair toppled over. It was then Alex noticed something taped to the wall, photos, dozens of them, depicting what looked like a celebration, masks, torches, and those scarcely dressed figures from Mara's photos, enacting what appeared to be ancient rituals right here in the supposedly serene cabin. The final shot made my heart stop, Mara front and center, surrounded by these strangers. Her eyes screamed of fear and betrayal, as if she knew her place as scapegoat in some unholy rite. I stumbled back, nausea rising. We had to find them. Just as panic set in anew, the forest outside seemed to awaken, distant chanting carried by the night breeze. Our flashlights cut through the darkness in slicing ribbons, each movement not revealing what we sought but rather heightening the shadow's grasp. Eventually, we stumbled upon a clearing where the site close to insanity lay bare, a circle of shadowy figures with Mara at the center, dazed, a crown of thorns atop her head, eyes flickering between terrified awareness and hallucinatory submission. My parents stood among them, faces eerily calm, void of recognition as I called out. My voice, a desperate echo swallowed by the forest, broke whatever ritualistic trance held them. For a moment, reality seemed to shudder, vibrating between ancient impulses and modern consciousness. The followers, once shadows, dissolved into the darkness, leaving only my family, visibly shaken and confused, as though waking from a nightmare. The morning came harsh and surreal, colors too bright, yet the night's horrors refused to fade. No one spoke on the ride back, the air thick with unspoken agreements never to speak of this, to question what indeed happened, what we had become a part of, knowingly or not. As days turned into weeks, I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, especially during twilight, where the setting sun made the shadows long and twisted once again, reminiscing of their untold rituals. And every so often, a garbled text from Mara would arrive, warning, or perhaps reminiscing, "It's not what it seems, always watch." Now, when friends ask why I didn't join the family vacation, I just give a wan smile and change the subject. Do they think I'm the asshole for skipping out? Perhaps. But deep down, a haunting part of me whispers that I narrowly escaped something only hinted at in my nightmares, and as shadows stretched long, I wonder if it was truly by choice, or some darker, primordial calling thwarted only by my absence. I never thought I'd find myself typing this out to a bunch of strangers on the internet, but here I am, shaking and unable to sleep. It was just an ordinary morning, the sun was creeping over the horizon, casting its first golden tendrils onto an unsuspecting world. I had been running late for work after my alarm decided to betray me, and I was in a rush, perhaps too much of a rush. You see, the road that stretches from my house to the office is a winding path through some dense woods, and despite its tranquil appearance, it transforms into a dark, shadowy gauntlet at dawn. There's this sharp turn just before you reach the bridge. Visibility there is close to zero when the morning fog rolls in, making it a spot that haunts the local news with accident reports every so often. You'd think I'd be more careful, having lived in this town my whole life, but I didn't see him. The jogger, that poor man, appeared out of nowhere, a fleeting specter from the mist. My heart is pounding just reliving it, the screech of the tires, the sickening thud, like the world collapsing into a single, terrifying moment. I pulled over, my hands trembling on the wheel. Panic surged through me, 1,000 what-ifs bombarding my mind. I stumbled out of the car, legs wobbly like jelly, and my heart pounding like a war drum. There he was, lying on the side of the road, motionless with the early light dancing over him like a cruel spotlight. I knelt beside him, my breath coming in ragged gasps, checking for any signs of life. He was breathing, barely. I wanted to call for help, every rational thought in my mind screamed at me to do so. But there was another voice, a quieter, sinister whisper, reminding me of the consequences. I glanced back at my car, the front bumper crumpled like an old tin can, and I felt a paralyzing wave of dread. In a flash, I imagined my life unraveling, my job, my freedom, my entire future hanging by a thread. I know how admissions of guilt work here, where the law and consequences feel more like the swing of a guillotine than the blindfolded Lady Justice. I couldn't afford it, literally and figuratively. And just like that, I was backing away, my survival instincts overwhelming any moral compass I had. I got in the car, every fiber of my being fighting my decision as I slammed the door shut and drove away, leaving him behind, alone and injured. I told myself I'd go to the police later once I sorted out my thoughts, but here I am, still undecided, my conscience screaming at me. The rest of my day blurred by like a bad dream, each sound amplified, the clacking of office keyboards, phones ringing, my boss's droning voice, all forming a cacophonic symphony that was slowly driving me insane. Not a soul seemed to notice my distress or the blood that I felt stained my every move. And then, as if by some cosmic jest, there was a newsflash, a hit and run on that very road, the jogger in critical condition with the police seeking any information. Guilt pierced through me, sharp and unrelenting, leaving me suffocating under its weight. Every face suddenly seemed to bear silent judgment, every eye a prying intruder into my burgeoning turmoil. My friends wondered why I was more quiet than usual, why I flinched at every shadow. And then the calls started. At first, it was just breathing, a soft, eerie rhythm echoing over the line whenever I answered, leaving me chilled to the bone. But then came a voice, distorted and hollow, whispering my name. I saw what you did. Each call lasted mere seconds but felt like an eternity, my sanity slipping with each new message. Was it him? Had he somehow found me, his spirit lingering in my wake, seeking justice, or was it guilt manifesting in my mind, wreaking havoc on my every thought? I unplugged the phone, hoping to cling to some last shred of peace. Yet, as I write this, my heart skips a beat at every creak and groan of the house, feeling eyes upon me in the shadows, waiting. I can't tell anyone. How could I bring myself to confess to such horror? I feel trapped in this spiral, caught between fear, regret, and a desperate need for redemption. The weight has become unbearable. I see him in my dreams now, standing on the edge of the fog, waiting, always watching. The dread has me tired and old more than I have ever been. What can I do when every path leads to my own ruin? I wish I could turn back the clock. If only I'd stopped to help, called for an ambulance, did something other than give in to panic. Maybe then I wouldn't be here, eyes wide open, fearing the inevitable knock on my door. It's only a matter of time before my crumbling resolve is torn apart by a reality of my own creation. How does one live with such a damning secret, a confession I wish I could share with more than just faceless companions on the internet? Maybe they know when your own words betray you, unraveling across a screen. So here I sit, hoping to find some solace or guidance, dreading both the implications of silence and the words now permanently etched into my digital confession. If you're reading this, it's likely because the bizarre events of last night have left me questioning reality itself. It all began with what seemed like a mundane family dinner at my parents' house, a familiar and comforting setting where the warmth of my mother's cooking typically wrapped everyone in a cocoon of safety. We had gathered to celebrate my father's birthday, a man whose only claim to fame within our family was his obsession with perfecting his lasagna recipe, a task he considered akin to an artist creating a masterpiece. The kitchen table was set with the usual fanfare, a glinting feast of layered pasta, rich sauces, and gooey cheeses that clung to one another like secrets held between close friends. As my family chatted noisily around the table, I felt a sudden itch for something different, a spark of rebellion in an otherwise harmonious evening. I reached for the forgotten bottle of hot sauce nestled inconspicuously at the end of the table. It was an impulse, a reckless urge for spiciness to break the monotony, like that tingling desire for a thrill to disrupt a peaceful night's sleep. As I dabbed that fiery elixir onto my slice, I was blissfully unaware that my small act of culinary rebellion would open a door to something far beyond human comprehension. At first, the room seemed to continue as it always had, filled with the lilting tunes of conversation and laughter echoing against the walls. But as I took the first bite, the spice tingled against my taste buds with a pleasurable intensity that was almost narcotic. That euphoric moment lasted only seconds before the atmosphere around me shifted, like a scene in a play where the actors forget their lines. My family's voices drained away into a distant hum, like a radio losing signal, and the room began to stretch and twist around me, pulsating with shadows that flickered in rhythm with my escalating anxiety. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, a rhythmic drum marking the entrance of a creeping dread that clawed its way up from the pit of my stomach. My father's usual jovial face now seemed to hang on his skull like the ill-fitting mask of a stranger, and as I glanced at the other end of the long dining table, where I expected to see my sister's cheeky grin, an overwhelming darkness loomed instead, a void where her familiar presence used to radiate warmth. Concealed within that void was a whisper, an incomprehensible murmur that rasped with the urgency of a forgotten nightmare. It spoke in a language my conscious mind couldn't decode, yet my soul understood perfectly, translating the chills that danced across my spine into a primal panic I couldn't shake. I turned, desperately seeking allies in this surreal battle against the unseen, yet when my eyes fell upon my parents and siblings, they were locked in place, eyes unblinking and vacant, as if they'd been pitched into a trance. I was alone in a room of statues, eerie replicas of my family, and from within those glassy eyes radiated an inexplicable awareness, an understanding that they were part of something I couldn't perceive, a dark reality lurking just beneath the veneer of my existence. Suddenly, I rose from my seat, driven by a primal instinct to flee but simultaneously chained by the irrational belief that leaving would condemn me to a fate I was not ready to comprehend. My eyes darted back to the plate of lasagna now turned cold and daunting, an artifact from the reality I had so thoughtlessly left behind with one impulsive act. And then came the laughter, not the mirthful sound of joyous celebration, but a guttural, echoing cackle that seemed to bubble up from deep within the earth itself. It reverberated through the walls, shaking the family photos until they hung askew, and with each laugh, the shadows in the room grew bolder, more tactile in their malice. They danced around me, taunting silently in a ballet of darkness that told me nothing and everything all at once. Was this madness a punishment for my culinary indifference, or was the universality of hot sauce simply an awakening, an unsealing of doors meant to remain shut tight? I staggered back from the table, my retreat halted only by the chill of the wall against my back as I sank onto the floor, hands pressing against my temples in a futile attempt to block out the resounding madness. But it was not until a hand, one lifelessly cold and unexpected, grasped my shoulder with an unforgiving strength that I realized I wasn't alone in my terror. A presence loomed behind me, indistinct yet real, its breath freezing the air upon my neck, whispering a mockery of existence itself as the real words it spoke slipped beyond my grasp like water through clenched fists. "Do you see now?" It whispered, each syllable a serrated edge slicing through my sanity. "Do you see the truth of what you dared to taste?" I dared not answer, could not breathe under the weight of its ancient, unfathomable malice. With a final surge of defiance, I twisted away, breaking free from its grip only to find myself back at the table, surrounded again by the pretense of family and comfort. They were talking as if nothing had occurred, as if reality had snapped seamlessly back into place, a twisted reminder that perhaps I had never left it. I stared numbly down at the heap of lasagna on my plate, the hot sauce now entirely absorbed into its folds, hinting at no evidence of the supernatural calamity it had unleashed. My family resumed their chatter, unaware of the dim specter of terror that had passed through our lives like an undetected virus. But within me lingered a dread I could neither shake nor explain, a seed of doubt in the fabric of what was real. Desperate, I shoved the lasagna away, the lingering smell of heat and spice curdling in my nostrils as I wondered if I'd summoned something that would never quite release its hold. I knew then that my life would never slip back into the comforting monotony I craved, that every echoing laugh and flickering shadow would forever carry the weight of that unspeakable presence. And as I bid my family goodbye, driving home through the night, I could almost see its eyes in the shadows cast by the streetlights, hear its insidious whisper in the rustling trees, reminding me that I can never escape what I'd tasted, annihilation sealed by the simple dip of lasagna into hot sauce. Last summer, I met Jared at a camping trip organized by mutual friends. We connected instantly over shared jokes about our mismatched gear and ended up rehashing every horror movie we could remember around the campfire. We dated through autumn, captivated by each other's company and a mutual love for the eerie. That winter, while rustling through the heat-blasted antique store, Jared found an intricate silver locket and clutched it to his chest with a surprisingly earnest look, claiming with a proud grin that it once belonged to his great-grandmother, Elise. She was a woman shrouded in family legends, known for bringing luck to those she favored and misfortune to those she didn't. He insisted I wear it, as though it sparked some familial tradition I was unconsciously participating in. I remember nervously tracing the etched initial ZL as he explained the importance. It supposedly carried blessings meant to guard the wearer, should the wearer worthy be. Our breakup came swiftly, just months shy of spring, after a petty argument spiraled grotesquely out of control. Jared's hiking boots thudded down my hallway one last time as he muttered demands to return every knick-knack or memento that exchanged hands during our transient affair. Among those items was Elise's locket. At the time, I found it strange how obsessed he was with getting it back, especially when everything else seemed to be more about closure than actual desire. But something made me hesitant, a slithering suspicion the locket had chosen me, and in that moment of defiance, I refused. That refusal sent veins of malice into his eyes, darkening softly from ocean blue to navy depths. His hesitance before he stormed off without another word left a strange weight in my chest. I knew I was on borrowed time. The first occurrence haunted my dreams, vivid, tangible distortions of reality where whispers echoed in unknown tongues as shadowy figures prowled the periphery of my vision. Each night they grew more pronounced. By midnight, Elise's locket morphed into a weighty artifact around my neck like ice, almost burning, compelling eyelids to twitch and eyebrows to itch. I'd wake breathless, convincing myself there were no shadowy figures near my windows, no shapes that skulked behind my bedroom door. My waking hours provided little solace. I felt them watching, a prickling at the nape of my neck, a chilling rustle disregarding the absence of any breeze. And wherever I went, I felt drawn, tethered to these perceptive specters like playful puppeteers slipping up. I started noticing how misfortunes played out like bad curses unraveling seamlessly, people around me suffering minor yet oddly consequential accidents. A 6-car pileup blocked my morning commute, neighbors yelled over burst pipes, even my mother's garden, usually lush, inexplicably withered. Every instance pulled me back to the locket, to Elise's secrets lurking between the lines of heritage tales I never wanted to hear again. As curious as I am, I cannot pretend I wasn't intrigued. An indiscernible pattern morphed into certainty when one particularly turbulent night, surrounded by flickering candlelight and the slipped threads of reality in my mind's cocoon, I dimly realized that the locket had never brought misfortune when it dangled on my neck. Indeed, it seemed to cradle me with silken safety as the world around unraveled. It occurred to me, who was protecting whom, and why did it feel like something waited in shadowed anticipation of Jared's strike? The days bled together seamlessly, my sleep-deprived eyes inspected each incident report closely. A framed photo slipped unbidden from my grasp, it shattered, revealing a hollow cavity behind it. Stuffed hastily between loose boards were the journal excerpts of Jared's great-grandmother Elise. Her neat scripts narrated not simply life as uneventful and serene but detailed how vividly the locket had similarly favored her, until she made the mistake of trying to sever the bond it held. Words dissolved into a muddle, a quick sketch etched a family deeply entrenched in the knowledge this trinket carried an unseen curse, a decidedly malevolent ancestress who punished those trying to control her gift against her wishes. That night, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged the air inside, sleep evaded me entirely, threads of Elise's narrative spooling in my mind. An overwhelming sense of presence pressed down, the room contracting as whispers clawed at my consciousness. Despite the terror, there, underneath was a peculiar certainty: Jared would return, and soon. The locket pulsated subtly, almost soothingly against my skin as pieces aligned. It was time to embrace the inheritance or suffer consequences beyond comprehension, to understand Elise's warning or be enveloped whole by the desires of restless spirits that refused to be forgotten. A few days later, I found a letter from Jared, devoid of any markings suggesting why it arrived unsealed and unmarred. His script was hurried, almost desperate, beseeching an exchange at a deserted park we frequented. The call echoed through me. Alone beneath skeletal trees towering against moonlit skies, I arrived at our meeting point, the air electric, laden with expectancy and vibrating harmonically against the locket's pulse. His silhouette wavered ahead, hands thrown up in mutual greetings shaped by shadows. He looked thinner, more haggard than our last encounter, akin to a man hollowed by relentless tides. It felt deceivingly straightforward. The locket hadn't merely kept the burdens at bay, it had consumed them. I could barely divine his apologies and mumbled regrets, how keeping it was beyond that of coveting and slipped entirely towards retribution. "She needs us to listen," his voice croaked, the realness of Elise manifesting finally through every choice I had made since the fateful day at the antique store. Beneath the searing gaze of spectral eyes, the air grew taut, dense with sorrowful resignation. "We cannot reverse it, only accept," Jared whispered, his hand extended in silent vow, urging a partnership extended beyond our corporeal ties into half-life reckonings. The transaction of spirits occurred not with fervor but with gentle, deliberate acceptance. At that instant, an unfurling sensation passed through every fiber of my being, as Elise laid claim to her chosen, binding unseen fates while freeing us to redefine our ghosted legacy with her ancestral shadow alongside us, always watchful, forever vigilant. Thus, the locket remains. Bound not to a finite life or love but a bond of necessity, a pact sealed in understanding cloaked among the whispers of trees that only stir and sing when our footsteps pass through, as they will, for all eternity.